This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share the videos. This audiobook is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 10, Ahmednagar Fort Again. Part 1, The Chain of Happening. Ahmednagar Fort. August 13, 1944. It is just over 2 years since we came here, 2 years of a dream life rooted in one spot, with the same few individuals to see, the same limited environment, the same routine from day to day. Sometime in the future, we shall wake up from this dream and go out into the wider world of life and activity, finding it a changed world. There will be an air of unfamiliarity about the persons and things we see, we shall remember them again and past memories will crowd into our minds, and yet they will not be the same, nor will we be the same, and we may find it difficult to fit in with them. Sometimes, we may wonder whether this renewed experience of everyday living is not itself a sleep and a dream from which we may suddenly wake up. Which is the dream and which is the waking? Are they both real, for we experience and feel them in all their intensity, or are they both unsubstantial and of the nature of fleeting dreams, which pass, leaving vague memories behind? Prison and its attendant solitude and passivity lead to thought and an attempt to fill the vacuum of life with memories of past living, of one's own life, and of the long chain of history of human activity. So during the past 4 months, in the course of this writing, I have occupied my mind with India's past records and experiences, and out of the multitude of ideas that came to me, I have selected some, and made a book out of them. Looking back at what I have written, it seems inadequate, disjointed and lacking in unity, a mixture of many things, with the personal element dominant and giving its color even to what was intended to be an objective record and analysis. That personal element has pushed itself forward almost against my will, often I checked it and held it back, but sometimes I loosened the reins and allowed it to flow out of my pen, and mirror, to some extent, my mind. By writing of the past, I have tried to rid myself of the burden of the past. But the present remains with all its complexity and irrationality, and the dark future that lies beyond, and the burden of these is no less than that of the past. The vagrant mind, finding no haven, still wanders about restlessly, bringing discomfort to its possessor as well as to others. There is some envy for those virgin minds, which have not been soiled or violated by thought's assault, and on which doubt has cast no shadow nor written a line. How easy is life for them in spite of its occasional shock and pain. Events take place one after the other, and the uninterrupted and unending stream of happenings goes on. We seek to understand a particular event by isolating it and looking at it by itself, as if it were the beginning and the end, the resultant of some cause immediately preceding it. Yet, it has no beginning, and is but a link in an unending chain, caused by all that has preceded it, and resulting from the wills, urges, and desires of innumerable human beings coalescing and conflicting with each other, and producing something different from that which any single individual intended to happen. Those wills, urges, and desires are themselves largely conditioned by previous events and experiences, and the new event in its turn becomes another conditioning factor for the future. The man of destiny, the leader who influences the multitude, undoubtedly plays an important part in this process, and yet, he himself is the product of past events and forces, and his influence is conditioned by them. End of Part 1, titled, The Chain of Happening, of Chapter 10. Part 2, The Two Backgrounds, Indian and British. What happened in India in August, 1942, was no sudden development but a culmination of all that had gone before. Much has been written about it, in attack, criticism or defense, and many explanations given. And yet most of this writing misses the real meaning, for it applies purely political considerations to something that was deeper than politics. Behind it all lay an intense feeling that it was no longer possible to endure and live under foreign autocratic rule. All other questions became secondary, whether under that rule, it was possible to make improvements or progress in some directions, or whether the consequences of a challenge might be more harmful still. Only the overwhelming desire to be rid of it, and to pay any price for the riddance remained, only the feeling that whatever happened, this could not be endured. That feeling was no new sensation, it had been there for many years. But previously it had been restrained in many ways and disciplined to keep pace with events. The war itself was both a restraining and releasing factor. It opened out our minds to vast developments and revolutionary changes, to the possibility of the realization of our hopes in the near future, and it put a brake on much that we might otherwise have done because of our desire to help, and certainly not to hinder in any way, the struggle against the Axis powers. But, as the war developed, it became ever clearer that the Western democracies were fighting not for a change, but for a perpetuation of the old order. Before the war, they had appeased fascism, not only because of the fear of its consequences, but also because of a certain ideological sympathy with it and an extreme dislike of some of the probable alternatives to it. Nazism and fascism were no sudden growths or accidents of history. They were the natural developments of the past course of events, of empire and racial discrimination, of national struggles, of the growing concentration of power, of technological growth, which found no scope for its fulfillment within the existing framework of society, of the inherent conflict between the democratic ideal and a social structure opposed to it. Political democracy in Western Europe and North America, opening the door to national and individual progress, had also released new forces and ideas, aiming inevitably at economic equality. Conflict was inherent in the situation. There would either be an enlargement of that political democracy or attempts to curb it and end it. Democracy grew in content and area, in spite of constant opposition, and became the accepted ideal of political organization. But a time came when a further expansion endangered the basis of the social structure, and then the upholders of that structure became clamant and aggressive and organized themselves to oppose change. In countries so circumstanced that the crisis developed more rapidly, democracy was openly and deliberately crushed and fascism and Nazism appeared. In the democracies of Western Europe and North America, the same processes were at play, though many other factors delayed the crisis, and probably, the much longer tradition of peaceful and democratic government also helped. Behind some of these democracies lay empires where there was no democracy at all, and where the same kind of authoritarianism, which is associated with fascism, prevailed. There also, as in fascist countries, the governing class allied itself to reactionary and opportunist groups and feudal survivals in order to suppress the demand for freedom. And there also they began to assert that democracy, though good as an ideal and desirable in their own homelands, was not suited to the peculiar conditions prevailing in their colonial domains. So it was a natural consequence for these Western democracies to feel some kind of an ideological bond with fascism, even when they disliked many of its more brutal and vulgar manifestations. When they were forced to fight in self-defense, they looked forward to a restoration of that very structure which had failed so dismally. The war was looked upon and presented as a defensive war, and this was true enough in a way. But there was another aspect of the war, a moral aspect, which went beyond military objectives and attacked aggressively the fascist creed and outlook. For it was a war, as has been said, for the soul of the peoples of the world. In it lay the seeds of change, not only for the fascist countries, but also for the United Nations. This moral aspect of the war was obscured by powerful propaganda, and emphasis was laid on defense and perpetuation of the past and not on creating a new future. There were many people in the West who ardently believed in this moral aspect and wanted to create a new world, which would afford some guarantees against that utter failure of human society which the World War represented. There were vast numbers of people everywhere, including especially the men, who fought and died on the field of battle, who vaguely but firmly hoped for this change. And there were those hundreds of millions of the dispossessed and exploited and racially discriminated against in Europe and America, and much more so in Asia and Africa, who could not isolate the war from their memories of the past and their present misery, and passionately hoped, even when hope was unreasonable, that the war would somehow lift the burdens that crushed them. But the eyes of the leaders of the United Nations were turned elsewhere. They looked back to the past and not forward to the future. Sometimes, they spoke eloquently of the future to appease the hunger of their people, but their policy had little to do with these fine phrases. For Mr. Winston Churchill it was a war of restoration and nothing more, a continuation, with minor changes, of both the social structure of England and the imperial structure of her empire. President Roosevelt spoke in terms of greater promise, but his policy had not been radically different. Still many people all over the world looked to him with hope as a man of vision and high statesmanship. So the future for India and the rest of the world, in so far as the British ruling class could help it, would be in line with the past, and the present had necessarily to conform to it. In that very present, the seeds of this future were being sown. The Cripps proposals, for all their seeming advance, created new and dangerous problems for us, which threatened to become insuperable barriers to freedom. To some extent, they have already had this result. The all-pervading autocracy and authoritarianism of the British government in India, and the widespread suppression of the most ordinary civil rights and liberties, had reached their further limits during, and under cover of, the war. No one in the present generation had experienced the like of these. They were constant reminders of our enslaved condition and continuing humiliation. They were also a presage of the future, of the shape of things to come, for out of this present, the future would grow. Anything seemed to be better than to submit to this degradation. How many people out of India's millions felt this way is impossible to say. For most of those millions, all conscious feeling has been deadened by poverty and misery. Among the others were those who had been corrupted by office or privilege or vested interest, or whose minds had been diverted by special claims. Yet the feeling was very widespread, varying in intensity, and sometimes overlaid by other feelings. There were many gradations in it, from an intensity of belief and a desire to brave all hazards, which led inevitably to action, to a vague sympathy from a safe distance. Some, tragically inclined, felt suffocated and strangled at the lack of air to breathe in the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded them. Others, living on the ordinary trivial plane, had more capacity to adapt themselves to conditions they disliked. The background of the British governing personnel in India was entirely different. Indeed, nothing is more striking than the vast gulf that separates the mind of the British and the Indians, and whoever may be right or wrong, this very fact demonstrates the utter incapacity of the British to function as a ruling class in India. For there must be some harmony, some common outlook, between the rulers and the ruled if there is to be any advance, otherwise there can only be conflict, actual or potential. The British in India have always represented the most conservative elements of Britain. Between them and the liberal tradition in England, there is little in common. The more years they spend in India, the more rigid they grow in outlook, and when they retire and go back to England, they become the experts who advise on Indian problems. They are convinced of their own rectitude, of the benefits and necessity of British rule in India, of their own high mission in being the representatives of the imperial tradition. Because the National Congress has challenged the whole basis of this rule and sought to rid India of it, it has become, in their eyes, public enemy number one. Sir Reginald Maxwell, the then Home Member of the Government of India, speaking in the Central Assembly in 1941, gave a revealing glimpse of his mind. He was defending himself against the charge that congressmen and socialists and communists, detained without trial in prison, were subjected to inhuman treatment, far worse than that given to German and Italian prisoners of war. He said that Germans and Italians were, at any rate, fighting for their countries, but these others were enemies of society who wanted to subvert the existing order. Evidently, it seemed to him preposterous that an Indian should want freedom for his country or should want to change the economic structure of India. As between the two, his sympathies were obviously for the Germans and Italians, though his own country was engaged in a bitter war against them. This was before Russia entered the war, and it was safe then to condemn every attempt to change the social order. Before World War II began, admiration for the fascist regimes was frequently expressed. Had not Hitler himself said, in his Mein Kampf and subsequently, that he wanted the British Empire to continue? The government of India certainly was anxious to help in every way in the war against the Axis powers. But in its mind that victory would be incomplete if it was not accompanied by another victory, the crushing of the nationalist movements in India as represented mainly by the Congress. The Cripps negotiations had perturbed it, and it rejoiced at their failure. The way was now open to deal the final blow at the Congress and all those who sided with it. The moment was favorable, for at no previous time had there been such concentration of unlimited power, both at the center and in the provinces, in the hands of the Viceroy and his principal subordinates. The war situation was a difficult one, and it was a feasible argument that no opposition or trouble could be tolerated. Liberal elements in England and America, interested in India, had been quietened by the Cripps affair and the propaganda that followed. In England, the ever-present feeling of self-righteousness in relation to India had grown. Indians, or many of them, it was felt there, were intransigent, troublesome persons, narrow in outlook, unable to appreciate the dangers of the situation, and probably in sympathy with the Japanese. Mr. Gandhi's articles and statements, it was said, had proved how impossible he was, and the only way left open was to put an end to all this by crushing Gandhi and the Congress once for all. End of Part 2, titled, The Two Backgrounds, Indian and British, of Chapter 10. Part 3, Mass Upheavals and Their Suppression. In the early morning of August 9, 1942, numerous arrests were made all over India. What happened then? Only scraps of news trickled through to us after many weeks, and even now, we can form only an incomplete picture of what took place. All the prominent leaders had been suddenly removed and no one seemed to know what should be done. Protests, of course, there had to be, and there were spontaneous demonstrations. These were broken up and fired upon, and tear gas bombs were used. All the usual channels of giving expression to public feeling were stopped. And then, all these suppressed emotions broke out and crowds gathered in cities and rural areas and came in conflict with the police and the military. They attacked especially what seemed to them the symbols of British authority and power, the police stations, post offices, and railway stations. They cut the telegraph and telephone wires. These unarmed and leaderless mobs faced police and military firing, according to official statements, on 538 occasions, and they were also machine-gunned from low-flying aircraft. For a month or two or more these disturbances continued in various parts of the country, and then they dwindled away and gave place to sporadic occurrences. The disturbances, said Mr. Churchill in the House of Commons, were crushed with all the weight of the government, and he praised the loyalty and steadfastness of the brave Indian police as well as the Indian official class generally, whose behavior has been deserving of the highest praise. He added that larger reinforcements have reached India, and the number of white troops in that country is larger than at any time in the British connection. These foreign troops and the Indian police had won many a battle against the unarmed peasantry of India and crushed their rebellion, and that other main prop of the British Raj in India, the official class, had helped, actively or passively, in the process. This reaction in the country was extraordinarily widespread, both in towns and villages. In almost all the provinces and in a large number of the Indian states there were innumerable demonstrations, in spite of official prohibition. There were hartals, closure of shops and markets and a stoppage of business everywhere, varying in duration from a number of days to some weeks, and in a few cases, to over a month. So also labor strikes. More organized and used to disciplined group action, industrial workers in many important centers spontaneously declared strikes in protest against government action in arresting national leaders. A notable instance of this was at the vital steel city of Jamshedpur, where the skilled workers, drawn from all over India, kept away from work for a fortnight, and only agreed to return on the management promising that they would try their best to get the Congress leaders released and a national government formed. In the great textile center of Ahmedabad also there was a sudden and complete stoppage of work in all the numerous factories without any special call from the trade union. Footnote: it has been stated by high government officials, and frequently repeated by others, that these strikes, especially in Jamshedpur and Ahmedabad, were encouraged by the employers and mill owners. This is hardly credible, for the strikes involved the employers in very heavy losses, and I have yet to know big industrialists who work against their own interests in this manner. It is true that many industrialists sympathize with and desire India's independence, but their conception of India's freedom is necessarily one in which they have a secure place. They dislike revolutionary action and any vital change in the social structure. It is possible, however, that influenced by the depth and widespread character of public feeling in August and September 1942, they refrained from adopting that aggressive and punitive attitude, in cooperation with the police, which they usually indulge in when strikes take place. Another frequent assertion, almost taken for granted in British circles and the British press, is that the Indian Congress is heavily financed by the big industrialists. This is wholly untrue, and I ought to know something about it as I have been General Secretary and President of the Congress for many years. A few industrialists have financially helped from time to time in the social reform activities of Gandhiji and the Congress, such as village industries, abolition of untouchability and raising of depressed classes, basic education, etc., but they have kept scrupulously aloof from the political work of the Congress, even in normal times, and much more so during periods of conflict with government. Whatever their occasional sympathies, they believe, like most sober and well-established individuals, in safety first. Congress work has been carried on almost entirely on the petty subscriptions and donations of its large membership. Most of the work has been voluntary and unpaid. Occasionally, in the cities, the merchants have helped a little. The only exception to this was probably during the general elections of 1937, when some big industrialists contributed to the Central Election Fund. Even this fund, considering the scope of our activity, was inconsiderable. It is astonishing, and it will be incredible to Westerners, with what little money we have carried on our work in the Congress during the last quarter of a century, a period when India has been convulsed repeatedly by political activity and direct action movements. In the United Provinces, one of our most active and well-organized provinces, and one with which I am best acquainted, almost our entire work was based on the 4 Anna subscriptions of our members. End of footnote. This general strike in Ahmedabad continued peacefully for over 3 months in spite of all attempts to break it. It was a purely political and spontaneous reaction of the workers, and they suffered greatly, for it was a time of relatively high wages. They received no financial help whatever from outside during this long period. At other centers, the strikes were of briefer duration, lasting sometimes only for a few days. Kanpur, another big textile center, had, so far as I know, no major strike, chiefly because the communist leadership there succeeded in averting it. In the railways also, which are government-owned, there was no marked or general stoppage of work, except such as was caused by the disturbances, and this latter was considerable. Among the provinces, the Punjab was probably the least affected, but there were many hartals and strikes even there. The northwest frontier province, almost exclusively Muslim in population, occupied a peculiar position. To begin with, there were no mass arrests or other provocative action there on the part of the government, as in the other provinces. This may have been partly due to the fact that the frontier people were considered inflammable material, but also partly to the policy of government to show that Muslims were keeping apart from the nationalist upheaval. But when news of happenings in the rest of India reached the frontier province, there were numerous demonstrations and even aggressive challenges to British authority. There was firing on the demonstrators, and the usual methods of suppressing popular activities were adopted. Several thousands of people were arrested, and even the great Pathan leader Badshah Khan, as Abdul Ghaffar Khan is popularly known, was seriously injured by police blows. This was extreme provocation, and yet, surprisingly enough, the excellent discipline, which Abdul Ghaffar Khan had established among his people, held, and there were no violent disturbances there of the kind that occurred in many parts of the country. The sudden, unorganized demonstrations and outbreaks on the part of the people, culminating in violent conflicts and destruction, and continued against overwhelming and powerful armed forces, were a measure of the intensity of their feelings. Those feelings had been there even before the arrest of their leaders, but the arrests, and the frequent firings that followed them, roused the people to anger and to the only course that an enraged mob can follow. For a time, there seems to have been a sense of uncertainty as to what should be done. There was no direction, no program. There was no well-known person to lead them or tell them what to do, and yet they were too excited and angry to remain quiescent. As often happens in these circumstances, local leaders sprang up and were followed for the moment. But even the guidance they gave was little, it was essentially a spontaneous mass upheaval. All over India, the younger generation, especially university students, played an important part in both the violent and peaceful activities of 1942. Many universities were closed. Some of the local leaders attempted even then to pursue peaceful methods of action in civil disobedience, but this was difficult in the prevailing atmosphere. The people forgot the lesson of nonviolence which had been dinned into their ears for more than 20 years, and yet they were wholly unprepared, mentally or otherwise, for any effective violence. That very teaching of nonviolent methods produced doubt and hesitation and came in the way of violent action. If the Congress, forgetful of its creed, had previously given even a hint of violent action, there is no doubt that the violence that actually took place would have increased 100-fold. But no such hint had been given, and, indeed, the last message of the Congress had again emphasized the importance of nonviolence in action. Yet perhaps one fact had some effect on the public mind. If, as we had said, armed defense was legitimate and desirable against an enemy aggressor, why should that not apply to other forms of existing aggression? The prohibition of violent methods of attack and defense once removed had unintended results, and it was not easy for most people to draw fine distinctions. All over the world extreme forms of violence were prevailing and incessant propaganda encouraged them. It became then a question of expediency and of intensity of feeling. Then there were also people, outside or in the Congress, who never had any belief in nonviolence, and who were troubled with no scruples in regard to violent action. But in the excitement of the moment few people think, they act in accordance with their long-suppressed urges which drive them forward. And so, for the first time since the Great Revolt of 1857, vast numbers of people again rose to challenge by force, but a force without arms, the fabric of British rule in India. It was a foolish and inopportune challenge, for all the organized and armed force was on the other side, and in greater measure indeed than at any previous time in history. However great the numbers of the crowd, it cannot prevail in a contest of force against armed forces. It had to fail, unless those armed forces themselves changed their allegiance. But those crowds had not prepared for the contest or chosen the time for it. It came upon them unawares, and in their immediate reaction to it, however unthinking and misdirected it was, they showed their love of India's freedom, and their hatred of foreign domination. Though the policy of nonviolence went under, for the time being at least, the long training that the people had received under it had one important and desirable result. In spite of the passions aroused, there was very little, if any, racial feeling, and, on the whole, there was a deliberate attempt on the part of the people to avoid causing bodily injury to their opponents. There was a great deal of destruction of communications and governmental property, but even in the midst of this destruction, care was taken to avoid loss of life. This was not always possible or always attempted, especially in actual conflicts with the police or other armed forces. According to official reports, so far as I have been able to find them, about 100 persons were killed by mobs in the course of the disturbances all over India. This figure is very small considering the extent and area of the disturbances and the conflicts with the police. One particularly brutal and distressing case was the murder of 2 Canadian airmen by a mob somewhere in Bihar. But, generally speaking, the absence of racial feeling was very remarkable. Footnote: a revealing incident is reported in British Soldier Looks at India, being letters of Clive Branson. Branson was an artist and a communist. He served in the International Brigade in Spain, and in 1941 joined the Royal Armoured Corps, in which he was a sergeant. He was sent to India with his regiment in 1942. In February 1944, he was killed in action in Arakan in Burma. He was in Bombay in August 1942, after the arrest of the Congress leaders, and at a time when the people of Bombay were seething with anger and passion and were being shot down. Branson is reported to have said, "What a clean, healthy nationalism you have. I asked people the way to the Communist Party's office. I was in uniform. Men like me were shooting unarmed Indians, and naturally, I was a little worried. I wondered how I would be treated. But everyone whom I asked was anxious to help, not one tried to insult or mislead me." End of footnote. Official estimates of the number of people killed and wounded by police or military firing in the 1942 disturbances are 1,028 killed and 3,200 wounded. These figures are certainly gross underestimates, for it has been officially stated that such firing took place on at least 538 occasions, and besides this, people were frequently shot at by the police or the military from moving lorries. It is very difficult to arrive at even an approximately correct figure. Popular estimates place the number of deaths at 25,000, but probably this is an exaggeration. Perhaps 10,000 may be nearer the mark. It was extraordinary how British authority ceased to function over many areas, both rural and urban, and it took many days, and sometimes weeks, for a reconquest, as it was often termed. This happened particularly in Bihar, in the Midnapur district of Bengal, and in the southeastern districts of the United Provinces. It is noteworthy that in the district of Balia, in the United Provinces, which had to be reconquered, there have been no serious allegations of physical violence and injury to human beings caused by the crowds, so far as one can judge from the numerous subsequent trials by special tribunals. The ordinary police proved incapable of meeting the situation. Early in 1942, however, a new force called the Special Armed Constabulary (SAC) had been created, and this had been especially trained to deal with popular demonstrations and disturbances. This played an important part in curbing and suppressing the people and often functioned after the manner of the Black and Tarts in Ireland. The Indian Army was not often used in this connection, except for certain groups and classes in it. British soldiers were more often employed, and also the Gurkhas. Sometimes Indian soldiers as well as the special police were sent to distant parts of the country where they functioned more or less as strangers, being unacquainted with the language. If the reaction of the crowd was natural, so also, in the circumstances, was the reaction of the government. It had to crush both the impromptu frenzy of the mob and the peaceful demonstrations of other people, and in the interests of its own self-preservation, attempt to destroy those whom it considered its enemies. If it had had the capacity or desire to understand and appreciate what moved the people so powerfully, the crisis would not have risen at all and India's problem would have been nearer solution. The government had prepared carefully to crush once for all, as it thought, any challenge to its authority. It had taken the initiative and chosen the time for its first blow. It had removed to its prisons thousands of men and women who had played a prominent part in the nationalist, the labor, and the peasant movements. Yet, it was surprised and taken aback by the upheaval that suddenly convulsed the country, and momentarily, its widespread apparatus of repression was disjoined. But it had enormous resources at its command, and it utilized them to crush both the violent and non-violent manifestations of the rebellion. Many of the upper and richer classes, timidly nationalist, and sometimes even critical of government, were frightened by this exhibition of mass action on an all-India scale, which cared little for vested interests, and smelt not only of political revolution but also of social change. As the success of the government in crushing the rebellion became apparent, the waverers and the opportunists lined up with it, and began to curse all those who had dared to challenge authority. The external evidences of rebellion having been crushed, its very roots had to be pulled out, and so the whole apparatus of government was turned in this direction in order to enforce complete submission to British domination. Laws could be produced overnight by the Viceroy's decree or ordinance, but even the formalities of these laws were reduced to a minimum. The decisions of the Federal Court and the High Courts, which were creations and emblems of British authority, were flouted and ignored by the executive, or a new ordinance was issued to override those decisions. Special tribunals, which were subsequently held by the courts to be illegal, were established, functioning without the trammels of the ordinary rules of procedure and evidence, and these sentenced thousands to long terms of imprisonment and many even to death. The police, and especially the Special Armed Constabulary, and the Secret Service were all powerful and became the chief organs of the state, and could indulge in any illegalities or brutalities without criticism or hindrance. Corruption grew to giant proportions. Vast numbers of students and schools and colleges were punished in various ways, and thousands of young men were flogged. Public activity of all kinds was prohibited unless it was in favor of the government. But the greatest sufferers were the simple-hearted, poverty-stricken villagers of the rural areas. Suffering, for many generations, had been the badge of their tribe. They had ventured to look up and hope, to dream of better times. They had even roused themselves to action. Whether they had been foolish or mistaken or not, they had proved their loyalty to the cause of Indian freedom. Their effort had failed, and the burden had fallen on their bent shoulders and broken bodies. Cases were reported of whole villages being sentenced from flogging to death. It was stated on behalf of the Bengal government that government forces burnt 193 Congress camps and houses in the subdivisions of Tamluk and Kantai before and after the cyclone of 1942. The cyclone had worked havoc in that area and created a wilderness, but that made no difference to the official policy. Huge sums were imposed on villages as a whole as punitive fines. According to Mr. Amory's statement in the House of Commons, the total collective fines amounted to rupees 90 lakhs, 9 million, and out of this 7,850,000 rupees were realized. How these vast sums were realized from starving wretches is another matter, and nothing that took place in 1942 or after, not the shooting and the burning by the police, caused such an intensity of suffering as this forcible realization. Not merely were the fines imposed realized, but often much more, the excess vanishing in the process of realization. All the conventions and subterfuges, that usually veil the activities of governments, were torn aside and only naked force remained as the symbol of power and authority. There was no further need for subterfuge, for the British power had succeeded, at least for the time being, in crushing both the non-violent and violent attempts made to replace it by a national authority, and stood supreme in India. India had failed in that final test when strength and power only count and all else is mere quibbling and irrelevance. She had failed not only because of British armed might and the confusion produced by the war situation in people's minds, but also because many of her own people were not prepared for that last sacrifice which freedom requires. So the British felt they had firmly re-established their rule in India, and they saw no reason to loosen their hold again. End of Part 3, titled, Mass Upheavals and Their Suppression, of Chapter 10. Part 4, Reactions Abroad. A strict censorship cast a heavy veil over the happenings in India. Even newspapers in India were not permitted to give publicity to much that was daily taking place, and messages to foreign countries were subject to an ever stricter surveillance. At the same time, official propaganda was let loose abroad and false and tendentious accounts were circulated. The United States of America were especially flooded with this propaganda, for opinion there was held to count, and hundreds of lecturers and others, both English and Indian, were sent there to tour the country. Even apart from this propaganda, it was natural in England, suffering the strain and anxiety of war, for resentment to be felt against Indians and especially those who were adding to their troubles in time of crisis. One-sided propaganda added to this, and even more so, the conviction of the British in their own righteousness. Their very lack of awareness of others' feelings had been their strength, and it continued to justify actions taken on their behalf, and to cast the blame for any mishap on the iniquity of others who were so blind to the obvious virtues of the British. Those virtues had now been justified afresh by the success of British forces and the Indian police in crushing those in India who had ventured to doubt them. Empire had been justified, and Mr. Winston Churchill declared, with special reference to India, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." In saying so, Mr. Churchill undoubtedly represented the viewpoint of the vast majority of his people, and even of many who had previously criticized the theory and practice of imperialism. The leaders of the British Labour Party, anxious to demonstrate that they were behind no other group in their attachment to the imperial tradition, supported Mr. Churchill's statement and stressed the resolve of the British people to keep the empire together after the war. In America, opinion, in so far as it was interested in the faraway problem of India, was divided, for people there were not equally convinced of the virtues of the British ruling class, and looked with some disapproval on other people's empires. They were also anxious to gain India's goodwill and utilize her resources fully in the war against Japan. Yet one-sided and tendentious propaganda inevitably produced results, and there was a feeling that the Indian problem was far too complicated for them to tackle, and anyway it was difficult for them to interfere in the affairs of their British ally. What those in authority, or people generally, in Russia thought about India it was impossible to say. They were far too busy with their stupendous war effort, and with driving the invader from their country, to think of matters of no immediate concern to them. Yet, they were used to thinking far ahead, and they were not likely to ignore India, which touched their frontiers in Asia. What their future policy would be no one could say, except that it would be realistic and principally concerned with adding to the political and economic strength of the USSR. They had carefully avoided all reference to India, but Stalin had declared in November 1942, on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution, that their general policy was abolition of racial exclusiveness, equality of nations and integrity of their territories, liberation of the enslaved nations and restoration of their sovereign rights, the right of every nation to arrange its affairs as it wishes, economic aid to nations that have suffered and assistance to them in attaining their material welfare, restoration of democratic liberties, the destruction of the Hitlerite regime. In China, it was evident that, whatever the reaction of the people to any particular action of ours, their sympathies were entirely on the side of Indian freedom. That sympathy had historical roots, but, even more so, it was based on the realization that unless India was free, China's freedom might be endangered. It was not in China only but throughout Asia, Egypt, and the Middle East, Indian freedom had become a symbol of a larger freedom for other subject and dependent countries, a test in the present and a measuring rod for the future. Mr. Wendell Willkie in his book, One World, says, "Many men and women I have talked with, from Africa to Alaska, asked me the question which has become almost a symbol all through Asia: what about India? From Cairo on, it confronted me at every turn. The wisest man in China said to me, when the aspiration of India for freedom was put aside to some future date, it was not Great Britain that suffered in public esteem in the Far East. It was the United States." What had happened in India had compelled the world to look at India for a while, even in the midst of the war crisis, and to think of the basic problems of the East. It had stirred the mind and heart of every country of Asia. Even though, for the moment, the Indian people appeared helpless in the powerful grip of British imperialism, they had demonstrated that there would be no peace in India or Asia unless India was free. End of Part 4, titled, Reactions Abroad, of Chapter 10. Part 5, Reactions in India. Foreign rule over a civilized community suffers from many disadvantages and many ills follow in its train. One of these disadvantages is that it has to rely on the less desirable elements in the population. The idealists, the proud, the sensitive, the self-respecting, those who care sufficiently for freedom and are not prepared to degrade themselves by an enforced submission to an alien authority, keep aloof or come into conflict with it. The proportion of careerists and opportunists in its ranks is much higher than it would normally be in a free country. Even in an independent country with an autocratic form of government, many sensitive people are unable to cooperate in governmental activities, and there are very few opportunities for the release of new talent. An alien government, which must necessarily be authoritarian, suffers from all these disadvantages and adds to them, for it has always to function in an atmosphere of hostility and suppression. Fear becomes the dominant motive of both the government and the people, and the most important services are the police and the Secret Service. When there is an actual conflict between the government and the people, this tendency to rely on and encourage the undesirable elements in the population becomes even more strongly marked. Many conscientious people, of course, through force of circumstances, have to continue functioning in the governmental structure, whether they like it or not. But those who come to the top and play the most important roles are chosen for their anti-nationalism, their subservience, their capacity to crush and humiliate their own countrymen. The highest merit is opposition, often the result of personal rivalries and disappointments, to the sentiments and feelings of the great majority of the people. In this turgid and unwholesome atmosphere no idealism or noble sentiment has any place, and the prizes held out are high positions and big salaries. The incompetence or worse failings of the supporters of government have to be tolerated, for the measure of everything is the active support given to that government in crushing its opponents. This leads to government cohabiting with strange groups and very odd persons. Corruption, cruelty, callousness, and a complete disregard of the public welfare flourish and poison the air. Footnote: the Bengal Administrative Inquiry Committee, presided over by Sir Archibald Rowlands, in their report, issued in May, 1945, say, so widespread has corruption become, and so defeatist is the attitude taken towards it, that we think that the most drastic steps should be taken to stamp out the evil which has corrupted the public service and public morals. The committee received, with surprise and regret, evidence that the attitude of some civil servants towards the public left much to be desired. It was stated that they adopt an attitude of aloof superiority, appear to pay greater regard to the mechanical operation of a soulless machine than to promoting the welfare of the people, and look upon themselves rather as masters than as servants of the people. End of footnote. While much that the government does is bitterly resented, far greater resentment is caused by those Indian supporters of it, who become more royalist than the king. The average Indian has a feeling of disgust and nausea at this behavior, and to him such people are comparable to the men of Vichy or the puppet regimes set up by the German and Japanese governments. This feeling is not confined to congressmen but extends to members of the Muslim League and other organizations, and is expressed even by the most moderate of our politicians. Footnote: Hitler, an expert in compelling others to submit to his yoke, says in Mein Kampf, we must not expect embodiments of characterless submission suddenly to repent in order, on the basis of intelligence and all human experience, to act otherwise than hitherto. On the contrary, these very people will hold every such lesson at a distance, until the notion is either once and for all accustomed to its slave's yoke, or until better forces push to the surface to wrest power from the infamous corruptors. In the first case, these people continue to feel not at all badly since they not infrequently are entrusted by the victors with the office of slave overseer, which these characterless types then exercise over their own nation, and that generally more heartlessly than any alien beast imposed by the enemy himself. End of footnote. The war afforded a sufficient excuse and was a cover for intense anti-national activities of the government in novel forms of propaganda. Mushroom labor groups were financed to build up labor morale, and newspapers containing scurrilous attacks on Gandhi and the Congress were started and subsidized, in spite of the paper shortage, which came in the way of other newspapers functioning. Official advertisements, supposed to be connected with the war effort, were also utilized for this purpose. Information centers were opened in foreign countries to carry on continuous propaganda on behalf of the Government of India. Crowds of undistinguished and often unknown individuals were sent on officially organized deputations, especially to the USA, despite the protest of the Central Assembly, to act as propaganda agents and stools of the British government. Persons holding independent views or critical of government policy had no chance of going abroad. They could neither get a passport nor transport facilities. All these and many other devices have been employed by the government during the last 2 years to create a semblance of what it considers public tranquility. Political and public life becomes dormant, as, indeed, it must in a country more or less under military occupation and rule. But this forcible suppression of symptoms can only cause an aggravation of the disease, and India is very sick. Prominent Indian conservatives, who have always tried to cooperate with the government, have been filled with anxiety at this volcano which has been temporarily sealed at its mouth, and they have stated that they have never known such bitterness against the British government. I do not know and cannot tell till I come into contact with my people, how they have changed during these 2 years and what feelings stir in their hearts, but I have little doubt that these recent experiences have changed them in many ways. I have looked into my own mind from time to time and examined its almost involuntary reaction to events. I had always looked forward in the past to a visit to England, because I have many friends there and old memories draw me. But now, I found that there was no such desire and the idea was distasteful. I wanted to keep as far away from England as possible, and I had no wish even to discuss India's problems with Englishmen. And then I remembered some friends and softened a little, and I told myself how wrong it was to judge a whole people in this way. I thought also of the terrible experiences that the English people had gone through in this war, of the continuous strain in which they had lived, of the loss of so many of their loved ones. All this helped to tone down my feelings, but that basic reaction remained. Probably time and the future will lessen it and give another perspective. But if I, with all my associations with England and the English, could feel that way, what of others who had lacked those contacts? End of Part 5, titled, Reactions in India, of Chapter 10. Part 6, India's Sickness, Famine. India was very sick, both in mind and body. While some people had prospered during the war, the burden on others had reached breaking point, and as an awful reminder of this came famine, a famine of vast dimensions affecting Bengal and East and South India. It was the biggest and most devastating famine in India during the past 170 years of British dominion, comparable to those terrible famines which occurred from 1766 to 1770 in Bengal and Bihar, as an early result of the establishment of British rule. Epidemics followed, especially cholera and malaria, and spread to other provinces, and even today they are taking their toll of scores of thousands of lives. Millions have died of famine and disease, and yet that specter hovers over India and claims its victims. Footnote: estimates of the number of deaths by famine in Bengal in 1943-44 vary greatly. The Department of Anthropology of the Calcutta University carried out an extensive scientific survey of sample groups in the famine areas. They arrived at the figure of about 3,400,000 total deaths by famine in Bengal. It was also found that during 1943 and 1944, 46% of the people of Bengal suffered from major diseases. Official figures of the Bengal government, based largely on unreliable reports from village patwaris or headmen, gave a much lower figure. The official Famine Inquiry Commission, presided over by Sir John Woodhead, has come to the conclusion that about 1,500,000 deaths occurred in Bengal as a direct result of the famine and the epidemics which followed in its train. All these figures relate to Bengal alone. Many other parts of the country also suffered from famine and epidemic diseases consequent upon it. End of footnote. This famine unveiled the picture of India as it was below the thin veneer of the prosperity of a small number of people at the top, a picture of poverty and ugliness of British rule. That was the culmination and fulfillment of British rule in India. It was no calamity of nature or play of the elements that brought this famine, nor was it caused by actual war operations and enemy blockade. Every competent observer is agreed that it was a man-made famine, which could have been foreseen and avoided. Everyone is agreed that there was amazing indifference, incompetence, and complacency shown by all the authorities concerned. Right up to the last moment, when thousands were dying daily in the public streets, famine was denied and references to it in the press were suppressed by the censors. When the Statesman, newspaper of Calcutta, published gruesome and ghastly pictures of starving and dying women and children in the streets of Calcutta, a spokesman of the Government of India, speaking officially in the Central Assembly, protested against the dramatization of the situation. To him apparently it was a normal occurrence for thousands to die daily from starvation in India. Mr. Amory, of the India office in London, distinguished himself especially by his denials and statements. And then, when it became impossible to deny or cloak the existence of widespread famine, each group in authority blamed some other group for it. The Government of India said it was the fault of the provincial government, which itself was merely a puppet government functioning under the governor and through the civil service. They were all to blame, but most of all inevitably that authoritarian government, which the viceroy represented in his person and which could do what it chose anywhere in India. In any democratic or semi-democratic country, such a calamity would have swept away all the governments concerned with it. Not so in India, where everything continued as before. Considered even from the point of view of the war, this famine took place in the very region which stood nearest to the theater of war and possible invasion. A widespread famine and collapse of the economic structure would inevitably injure the capacity for defense and even more so for offense. Thus, did the government of India discharge its responsibility for India's defense and the prosecution of the war against the Japanese aggressors. Not scorched earth, but scorched and starved and dead human beings by the million in this vital war area were the emblems of the policy that government had pursued. Indian non-official organizations from all over the country did good work in bringing relief, and so did those efficient humanitarians, the Quakers of England. The central and provincial governments also, at last, woke up and realized the immensity of the crisis, and the army was utilized in the relief operations. For the moment, something was done to check the spread of famine and mitigate its aftereffects. But the relief was temporary, and those aftereffects continue, and no one knows when famine may not descend again on an even worse scale. Bengal is broken up, her social and economic life shattered, and an enfeebled generation left as survivors. While all this was happening and the streets of Calcutta were strewn with corpses, the social life of the upper 10,000 of Calcutta underwent no change. There was dancing and feasting and a flaunting of luxury, and life was gay. There was no rationing even till a much later period. The horse races in Calcutta continued and attracted their usual fashionable throngs. Transport was lacking for food, but racehorses came in special boxes by rail from other parts of the country. In this gay life, both Englishmen and Indians took part, for both had prospered in the business of war and money was plentiful. Sometimes that money had been gained by profiteering in the very foodstuffs, the lack of which was killing tens of thousands daily. India, it is often said, is a land of contrasts, of some very rich and many very poor, of modernism and medievalism, of rulers and ruled, of the British and Indians. Never before had these contrasts been so much in evidence as in the city of Calcutta during those terrible months of famine in the latter half of 1943. The two worlds, normally living apart, almost ignorant of each other, were suddenly brought physically together, and existed side by side. The contrast was startling, but even more startling was the fact that many people did not realize the horror and astonishing incongruity of it, and continued to function in their old grooves. What they felt one cannot say, one can only judge them by their actions. For most Englishmen this was perhaps easier, for they had lived their life apart, and caste-bound as they were, they could not vary their old routine, even if some individuals felt the urge to do so. But those Indians, who functioned in this way, showed the wide gulf that separated them from their own people, which no considerations even of decency and humanity could bridge. The famine, like every great crisis, brought out both the good qualities and the failings of the Indian people. Large numbers of them, including the most vital elements, were in prison and unable to help in any way. Still, the relief works, organized unofficially, drew men and women from every class who labored hard under discouraging circumstances, displaying ability, the spirit of mutual help and cooperation and self-sacrifice. The failings were also evident in those who were too full of their petty rivalries and jealousies to cooperate together, those who remained passive and did nothing to help others, and those few who were so denationalized and dehumanized as to care little for what was happening. The famine was a direct result of war conditions, and the carelessness and complete lack of foresight of those in authority. The indifference of the authorities to the problem of the country's food passes comprehension, when every intelligent man who gave thought to the matter knew that some such crisis was approaching. The famine could have been avoided, given proper handling of the food situation in the earlier years of the war. In every other country affected by the war, full attention was paid to this vital aspect of war economy even before the war started. In India, the government of India started a food department 3¼ years after the war began in Europe, and over a year after the Japanese war started. And yet, it was common knowledge that the Japanese occupation of Burma vitally affected Bengal's food supply. The government of India had no policy at all in regard to food till the middle of 1943, when famine was already beginning its disastrous career. It is most extraordinary how inefficient the government always is in every matter other than the suppression of those who challenge its administration. Or perhaps it is more correct to say that, constituted as it is, its mind is completely occupied in its primary task of ensuring its own continuance. Only an actual crisis forces it to think of other matters. That crisis again is accentuated by the ever-present crisis of want of confidence in the government's ability and bona fides. Footnote: The Famine Inquiry Commission, presided over by Sir John Woodhead, report published in May, 1945, reveal in restrained official language the tragic succession of official errors and private greed which led to the Bengal famine. It has been for us a sad task, they say, to inquire into the course and causes of the Bengal famine. We have been haunted by a deep sense of tragedy. 1.5 million of the poor of Bengal fell victims to circumstances for which they themselves were not responsible. Society, together with its organs, failed to protect its weaker members. Indeed, there was a moral and social breakdown, as well as administrative breakdowns. They refer to the low economic level of the province, to the increasing pressure on land not relieved by growth of industry, to the fact that a considerable section of the population was living on the margin of subsistence and was incapable of standing any severe economic stress, to the very bad health conditions and low standards of nutrition, to the absence of a margin of safety as regards either health or wealth. They consider the more immediate causes to be the failure of the season's crop, the fall of Burma leading to stoppage of imports of Burma rice, to the denial policy of government which brought ruin to certain poorer classes, to the military demands on food and transport, and the lack of confidence in the government. They condemn the policy, or often the lack of policy or the ever-changing policy, of both the government of India and of the Bengal government, their inability to think ahead and provide for coming events, their refusal to recognize and declare famine even when it had come, their totally inadequate measures to meet the situation. They go on to say, but often considering all the circumstances, we cannot avoid the conclusion that it lay in the power of the government of Bengal, by bold, resolute and well-conceived measures at the right time to have largely prevented the tragedy of the famine as it actually took place. Further, that the government of India failed to recognize at a sufficiently early date the need for a system of planned movement of food grains. The government of India must share with the Bengal government responsibility for the decision to decontrol in March 1943. The subsequent proposal of the Government of India to introduce free trade throughout the greater part of India was quite unjustified and should not have been put forward. Its application, successfully resisted by many of the provinces and states, might have led to serious catastrophes in various parts of India. After referring to the apathy and mismanagement of the governmental apparatus both at the centre and in the province, the Commission say that the public in Bengal, or at least certain sections of it, have also their share of blame. We have referred to the atmosphere of fear and greed, which, in the absence of control, was one of the causes of the rapid rise in the price level. Enormous profits were made out of the calamity, and in the circumstances profits for some meant death for others. A large part of the community lived in plenty while others starved, and there was much indifference in face of suffering. Corruption was widespread throughout the province and in many classes of society. The total profit made in this traffic of starvation and death is estimated at 150 crores of rupees, 1,500 rupees millions. Thus, if there were 1.5 million deaths by famine, each death was balanced by roughly a 1,000 rupees of excess profit. End of footnote. Though the famine was undoubtedly due to war conditions and could have been prevented, it is equally true that its deeper causes lay in the basic policy which was impoverishing India, and under which millions lived on the verge of starvation. In 1933, Major General Sir John Meiga, the Director General of the Indian Medical Service, wrote in the course of a report on public health in India, taking India as a whole, the dispensary doctors regard 39% of the people as being well nourished, 41% as poorly nourished, and 20% as very badly nourished. The most depressing picture is painted by the doctors of Bengal, who regard only 22% of the people of the province as being well nourished, while 31% are considered to be very badly nourished. The tragedy of Bengal and the famines of Orissa, Malabar, and other places are the final judgment on British rule in India. The British will certainly leave India, and their Indian empire will become a memory, but what will they leave when they have to go? What human degradation and accumulated sorrow? Tagore saw this picture as he lay dying 3 years ago, but what kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery! When the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last, what a waste of mud and filth they will leave behind them. End of Part 6, titled, India's Sickness, Famine, of Chapter 10. Part 7, India's Dynamic Capacity. The stream of life goes on in spite of famine and war, full of its inherent contradictions, and finding sustenance even in those contradictions and the disasters that follow in their train. Nature renews itself and covers yesterday's battlefield with flowers and green grass, and the blood that was shed feeds the soil and gives strength and color to new life. Human beings with their unique quality of possessing memory live in their storied and remembered pasts and seldom catch up to the present in the world that kneweth every day. And that present slips into the past before we are hardly aware of it. Today, child of yesterday, yields place to its own offspring, tomorrow. Winged victory ends in a welter of blood and mud, and out of the heavy trials of seeming defeat the spirit emerges with new strength and wider vision. The weak in spirit yield and are eliminated, but others carry the torch forward and hand it to the standard-bearers of tomorrow. The famine in India brought some realization of the terrible urgency of India's problems, of the overwhelming disaster that hung over the country. What people in England felt about it, I do not know, but some of them, as is their way, cast the blame on India and her people. There was lack of food, lack of doctors, lack of sanitation and medical supplies, lack of transport, lack of everything except human beings, for the population had grown and seemed to be growing. This excessive population of an improvident race, growing without notice or warning, and upsetting the plans or planlessness of a benevolent government, must be to blame. And so, economic problems suddenly assumed a new importance, and we were told that politics and political problems had to be put aside, as if politics has any meaning at all unless it can solve the major problems of the day. The government of India, one of the few representatives of the laissez-faire tradition in the world, began to talk of planning, but of organized planning it had no notion. It could only think in terms of preserving the existing structure in its own and allied vested interests. The reaction on the people of India was deeper and more powerful, though it found little public expression owing to the widespread tentacles of the Defence of India Act and its rules. There had been a complete collapse of the economic structure of Bengal, and tens of millions of people had been literally broken up. Bengal was an extreme example of what was happening in many parts of India, and it seemed that there could be no going back to the old economy. Even the industrialists who had prospered so much during the war were shaken up and compelled to look beyond their narrow sphere. They were realists in their own way, rather afraid of the idealism of some of the politicians, but that realism itself led them to far-reaching conclusions. A number of Bombay industrialists, chiefly connected with the Tata enterprises, produced a 15-year plan for India's development. That plan is still not complete, and there are many lacunae in it. Inevitably, it is conditioned by the ways of thinking of big industry, and tries to avoid revolutionary changes as far as possible. Yet the very pressure of events in India has forced them to think in a big way, and to go out of many of their accustomed grooves of thought. Revolutionary changes are inherent in the plan, though the authors may themselves not like some of them. Some of these authors of the plan were members of the National Planning Committee, and they have taken advantage of a part of its work. This plan will undoubtedly have to be varied, added to and worked out in many ways, but, coming from conservative quarters, it is a welcome and encouraging sign of the way India must go. It is based on a free India, and on the political and economic unity of India. The conservative banker's view of money is not allowed to dominate the scene, and it is emphasized that the real capital of the country consists of its resources in material and manpower. The success of this or any other plan must inevitably depend not merely on production, but on a proper and equitable distribution of the national wealth created. Also, agrarian reform is a fundamental prerequisite. The idea of planning and a planned society is accepted now in varying degrees by almost everyone. But planning by itself has little meaning, and need not necessarily lead to good results. Everything depends on the objectives of the plan and on the controlling authority, as well as, of course, the government behind it. Does the plan aim definitely at the well-being and advancement of the people as a whole, at the opening out of opportunity to all, and the growth of freedom, and methods of cooperative organization and action? Increase of production is essential, but obviously, by itself it does not take us far and may even add to the complexity of our problems. An attempt to preserve old established privileges and vested interests cuts at the very root of planning. Real planning must recognize that no such special interests can be allowed to come in the way of any scheme designed to further the well-being of the community as a whole. The Congress governments in the provinces were hampered and restricted in all directions by the basic assumption of the parliamentary statute that most of these vested interests must not be touched. Even their partial attempts to change the land tenure system and to impose an income tax on incomes from land were challenged in the law courts. If planning is largely controlled by big industrialists, it will naturally be envisaged within the framework of the system they are used to, and will be essentially based on the profit motive of an acquisitive society. However well-intentioned they might be, and some of them certainly are full of good intentions, it is difficult for them to think on new lines. Even when they talk of state control of industry, they think of the state more or less as it is today. We are sometimes told that the present government of India, with its ownership and control of railways and a growing control of and interference in industry, finance, and, indeed, life in general, is moving in a socialist direction. But this is something utterly different from democratic state control, apart from being essentially foreign control. Though there is a limitation of certain capitalist functions, the system is based on the protection of privilege. The old authoritarian colonial system ignored economic problems, except in so far as certain special interests were concerned. Finding itself unable to meet the necessities of the new situation by its old laissez-faire methods, and yet bent on preserving its authoritarian character, it goes inevitably in a fascist direction. It tries to control economic operations by fascist methods, suppresses such civil liberties as exist, and adapts its own autocratic government as well as the capitalist system, with some variations, to the new conditions. Thus, the endeavor is, as in fascist countries, to build up a monolithic state, with considerable control of industry and national life, and with many limitations on free enterprise, but based on the old foundations. This is very far from socialism. Indeed, it is absurd to talk of socialism in a country dominated by an alien power. Whether such an attempt can succeed, even in a temporary sense, is very doubtful, for it only aggravates the existing problems, but war conditions certainly give it a favorable environment to work in. Even a complete nationalization, so-called, of industry, unaccompanied by political democracy, will lead only to a different kind of exploitation, for while industry will then belong to the state itself will not belong to the people. Our major difficulties in India are due to the fact that we consider our problems economic, social, industrial, agricultural, communal, Indian states, within the framework of existing conditions. Within that framework, and retaining the privileges and special status that are part of it, they become impossible of solution. Even if some patchwork solution is arrived at under stress of circumstances, it does not and cannot last. The old problems continue and new problems, or new aspects of old problems, are added to them. This approach of ours is partly due to tradition and old habit, but essentially it is caused by the steel frame of the British government which holds together the ramshackle structure. The war has accentuated the many contradictions existing in India, political, economic, and social. Politically, there is a great deal of talk of Indian freedom and independence, and yet her people have probably at no time in their long history been subjected to such authoritarian rule and intensive and widespread repression as exists today, and out of this today tomorrow will necessarily grow. Economically, British domination is also paramount, and yet, the expansive tendency of Indian economy is continually straining at the leash. There is famine and widespread misery, and on the other hand, there is an accumulation of capital. Poverty and riches go side by side, decay and building up, disruption and unity, dead thought and new. Behind all the distressing features, there is an inner vitality, which cannot be suppressed. Outwardly, the war has encouraged India's industrial growth and production, and yet, it is doubtful how far this has led to the establishment of new industries, or is merely an extension and diversion of old industries. The apparent stability of the index of India's industrial activity during wartime indicates that no fundamental advance has been made. Indeed, some competent observers are of the opinion that the war and British policy during it have actually had a hampering effect on India's industrial growth. Dr. John Mathai, an eminent economist and a director of Tatas, said recently, "The general belief that the war has tremendously accelerated India's industrial progress is a proposition which, to say the least, would need a lot of proving." While it is true that certain established industries have increased their production in response to the war demand, several new industries of fundamental importance to the country, which had been projected before the war have, under stress of war conditions, been either abandoned or been unable to reach completion. My personal view is that, on a careful balance of the various factors in the situation, it will be found that, unlike countries, such as Canada and Australia, the war has been more a hampering than an accelerating influence in India. I agree, however, that India has sufficient potential capacity to supply her basic manufactured needs. Such statistical evidence of industrial activity as is available supports this view, and indicates that if pre-war progress could have been maintained at the old rate, it would have led not only to the establishment of new industries, but also to far greater production as a whole. Footnote: Mr. J.R.D. Tata, speaking in London on May 30, 1945, also denied that the war had enabled India materially to expand her industries and industrial capacity. There may have been isolated cases of expansion, but on the whole, when armament factories and other specialized industries connected with the war have been excluded, there has been none. A number of projects would have been started if there had been no war. I can speak from personal experience of projects that have been abandoned because of the impossibility of obtaining bricks, steel, and machinery. Those who talk about industrial and economic progress in India during the war do not know the true position. Again he said, I must prick this bubble. It is nonsense to say that India has materially advanced and gained by the war. For one reason or another, there has been no important progress or development in India. Rather, there has been considerable retardation. In fact, what has happened is this. As a result of the war and India's contribution towards it, we have millions dead in Bengal owing to famine. We also have had famine of cloth. Thus, it is clear that economic progress has been conspicuous by its absence. End of footnote. What the war has demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt is India's capacity to convert this potential into actuality with remarkable speed, given the opportunity to do so. Functioning as an economic unit, she has accumulated large capital assets within 5 war years, in spite of all the obstructions placed in her way. These assets are in the form of sterling securities, which are not available to her, and which, it is stated, will be blocked in the future. These sterling securities represent the expenditure incurred by the Government of India on behalf of the British government as well as the USA. They also represent the hunger, famine, epidemics, emasculation, weakened resistance, stunted growth, and death by starvation and disease of vast numbers of human beings in India. Because of the accumulation of capital assets, India has paid off her big debt to England, and has become a creditor country. Owing to gross negligence and mismanagement, tremendous suffering has been caused to the people of India, but the fact remains that India can accumulate these huge sums in a short period of time. The actual expenditure on the war incurred by India in 5 years greatly exceeds the total British investments in India during more than 100 years. This fact brings into proper perspective how little the progress made in India has been during the past century of British administration, railways, irrigation works and the like of which we hear so much. It also demonstrates the enormous capacity of India to advance with rapidity on all fronts. If this striking effort can be made under discouraging conditions and under a foreign government, which disapproves of industrial growth in India, it is obvious that planned development under a free national government would completely change the face of India within a few years. There is a curious habit of the British of appraising their economic and social achievement in present-day India by criteria derived from social achievement here or elsewhere in the distant past. They compare, with evident satisfaction to themselves, what they have done in India during their regime with changes made some hundreds of years ago. The fact that the Industrial Revolution, and more especially the vast technological improvements of the past 50 years or so, have entirely changed the pace and tempo of life somehow escapes them when they think of India. They forget also that India was not a barren, sterile, and barbarous country when they came here, but a highly evolved and cultured nation which had temporarily become static and backward in technical achievements. What values and standards are we to apply in making such comparisons? The Japanese made Manchukuo within 8 years highly industrialized for their own purposes. More coal was being produced there than in India after many generations of British effort. Their material record in Korea compares well with other colonial empires. Footnote: Halidabend, who was the New York Times correspondent in the Far East for many years, says in his book Pacific Charter, 1943, in fairness to the Japanese it must be conceded that in a material sense they have done a magnificent job in Korea. When they took it over the country was filthy, unhealthy, and woefully poverty-stricken. The mountains had been denuded of their forests, the valleys were subject to recurrent floods, decent roads were non-existent, illiteracy was prevalent, and typhoid, smallpox, cholera, dysentery, and the plague were epidemic annually. Today the mountains are reforested, railway, telephone, and telegraph systems are excellent, the public health service is highly efficient, good highways abound, flood control and irrigation works have vastly increased the food production, and fine harbors have been developed and well managed. The country has become so prosperous and healthy that the 1905 population of 11 million has risen to 24 million and the average scale of living today is almost immeasurably higher than it was at the turn of the century. But Mr. Abend points out that all this material improvement has not been instituted for the benefit of the Korean people, but so that greater profits might go to the Japanese. End of footnote. And yet behind these records, there is slavery, cruelty, humiliation, exploitation, and the attempt to destroy the soul of a people. The Nazis and the Japanese have created new records in the inhuman suppression of subject peoples and races. We are often reminded of this and told that the British have not treated us quite so badly. Is that to be the new measure and standard of comparison and judgment? There is a great deal of pessimism in India today, and a sense of frustration, and both can be understood, for events have dealt harshly with our people, and the future is not promising. But there is also below the surface a stirring and a pushing, signs of a new life and vitality, and unknown forces are at work. Leaders function at the top, but they are driven in particular directions by the anonymous and unthinking will of an awakening people, who seem to be outgrowing their past. End of Part 7, titled, India's Dynamic Capacity, of Chapter 10. Part 8, India's Growth Arrested. A nation, like an individual, has many personalities, many approaches to life. If there is a sufficiently strong organic bond between these different personalities, it is well, otherwise those personalities split up and lead to disintegration and trouble. Normally, there is a continuous process of adjustment going on, and some kind of an equilibrium is established. If normal development is arrested, or sometimes if there is some rapid change, which is not easily assimilated, then conflict arises between those different personalities. In the mind and spirit of India, below the surface of our superficial conflicts and divisions, there has been this fundamental conflict due to a long period of arrested growth. A society, if it is to be both stable and progressive, must have a certain more or less fixed foundation of principles, as well as a dynamic outlook. Both appear to be necessary. Without the dynamic outlook there is stagnation and decay, without some fixed basis of principle, there is likely to be disintegration and destruction. In India, from the earliest days, there was a search for those basic principles, for the unchanging, the universal, the absolute. Yet the dynamic outlook was also present, and an appreciation of life and the changing world. On these two foundations, a stable and progressive society was built up, though the stress was always more on stability and security and the survival of the race. In later years, the dynamic aspect began to fade away, and in the name of eternal principles, the social structure was made rigid and unchanging. It was, as a matter of fact, not wholly rigid, and it did change gradually and continuously. But the ideology behind it and the general framework continued unchanged. The group idea is represented by more or less autonomous castes, the joint family and the communal self-governing life of the village were the main pillars of this system, and all these survived for so long, because, in spite of their failings, they fulfilled some essential needs of human nature and society. They gave security, stability to each group and a sense of group freedom. Caste survived because it continued to represent the general power relationships of society, and class privileges were maintained, not only because of the prevailing ideology, but also because they were supported by vigor, intelligence, and ability, as well as a capacity for self-sacrifice. That ideology was not based on a conflict of rights, but on the individual's obligations to others and a satisfactory performance of his duties, on cooperation within the group and between different groups, and essentially on the idea of promoting peace rather than war. While the social system was rigid, no limit was placed on the freedom of the mind. Indian civilization achieved much that it was aiming at, but, in that very achievement, life began to fade away, for it is too dynamic to exist for long in a rigid, unchanging environment. Even those basic principles, which are said to be unchanging, lose their freshness and reality when they are taken for granted and the search for them ceases. Ideas of truth, beauty, and freedom decay, and we become prisoners following a deadening routine. The very thing India lacked, the modern West possessed and possessed to excess. It had the dynamic outlook. It was engrossed in the changing world, caring little for ultimate principles, the unchanging, the universal. It paid little attention to duties and obligations and emphasized rights. It was active, aggressive, acquisitive, seeking power and domination, living in the present and ignoring the future consequences of its actions. Because it was dynamic, it was progressive and full of life, but that life was a fevered one and the temperature kept on rising progressively. If Indian civilization went to seed because it became static, self-absorbed and inclined to narcissism, the civilization of the modern West, with all its great and manifold achievements, does not appear to have been a conspicuous success or to have thus far solved the basic problems of life. Conflict is inherent in it and periodically it indulges in self-destruction on a colossal scale. It seems to lack something to give it stability, some basic principles to give meaning to life, though, what these are, I cannot say. Yet, because it is dynamic and full of life and curiosity, there is hope for it. India, as well as China, must learn from the West, for the modern West has much to teach, and the spirit of the age is represented by the West. But the West is also obviously in need of learning much, and its advances in technology will bring it little comfort if it does not learn some of the deeper lessons of life, which have absorbed the minds of thinkers in all ages and in all countries. India has become static, and yet it would be utterly wrong to imagine that she was unchanging. No change at all means death. Her very survival as a highly evolved nation shows that there was some process of continuous adaptation going on. When the British came to India, though technologically somewhat backward, she was still among the advanced commercial nations of the world. Technical changes would undoubtedly have come and changed India as they have changed some Western countries. But her normal development was arrested by the British power. Industrial growth was checked, and as a consequence social growth was also arrested. The normal power relationships of society could not adjust themselves and find an equilibrium, as all power was concentrated in the alien authority, which based itself on force and encouraged groups and classes, which had ceased to have any real significance. Indian life, thus, progressively became more artificial, for many of the individuals and groups, who seemed to play an important role in it had no vital functions left and were there only because of the importance given to them by the alien power. They had long ago finished their role in history, and would have been pushed aside by new forces if they had not been given foreign protection. They became straw-stuffed symbols of protégés of foreign authority, thereby cutting themselves still further away from the living currents of the nation. Normally, they would have been weeded out or diverted to some more appropriate function by revolution or democratic process. But so long as foreign authoritarian rule continued, no such development could take place. And so India was cluttered up with these emblems of the past, and the real changes that were taking place were hidden behind an artificial facade. No true social balances or power relationships within society could develop or become evident, and unreal problems assumed an undue importance. Most of our problems today are due to this arrested growth and the prevention by British authority of normal adjustments taking place. The problem of the Indian princes is easily capable of solution if the external factor is removed. The minorities problem is utterly unlike any minority problem elsewhere, indeed it is not a minority problem at all. There are many aspects of it, and no doubt we are to blame for it in the past and in the present. And yet, at the back of these and other problems is the desire of the British government to preserve, as far as possible, the existing economy and political organization of the Indian people, and, for this purpose, to encourage and preserve the socially backward groups in their present condition. Political and economic progress has not only been directly prevented, but also made dependent on the agreement of reactionary groups and vested interests, and this may be purchased only by confirming them in their privileged positions or giving them a dominating voice in future arrangement, and thus, putting formidable obstacles in the way of real change and progress. A new constitution, in order to have strength and effectiveness behind it, should not only represent the wishes of the vast majority of the people but should also reflect the interrelation of social forces and their power relationships at the time. The main difficulty in India has been that constitutional arrangements for the future suggested by the British, or even by many Indians, ignore present social forces, and much more so, potential ones, which have long been arrested and are now breaking out, and try to impose and make rigid, an order based on a past and vanishing relationship, which has no real relevance today. The fundamental reality in India is British military occupation and the policy which it supports. That policy has been expressed in many ways and has often been cloaked in dubious phrases, but latterly, under a soldier viceroy, it has been expressed with clarity. That military occupation is to continue so long as the British can help it. But there are certain limits to the application of force. It leads not only to the growth of opposing forces, but to many other consequences unthought of by those who rely upon it too much. We see the consequences of this enforced stunting of India's growth and this arresting of her progress. The most obvious fact is the sterility of British rule in India, and the thwarting of Indian life by it. Alien rule is inevitably cut off from the creative energies of the people it dominates. When this alien rule has its own economic and cultural center far from the subject country and is further backed by racialism, this divorce is complete, and leads to spiritual and cultural starvation of the subject peoples. The only real scope that the nation's creative energy finds is in some kind of opposition to that rule, and yet that scope itself is limited and the outlook becomes narrow and one-sided. That opposition represents the conscious or unconscious effort of the living and growing forces to break through the shell that confines them, and is thus a progressive and inevitable tendency. But it is too single-track and negative to have full touch with many aspects of reality in our lives. Complexes and prejudices and phobias grow and darken the mind, mental idols of the group and the community take shape, and slogans and set phrases take the place of inquiry into real problems. Within the farm work of a sterile alien rule, no effective solutions are possible, and national problems, unable to find solution, become even more acute. We have arrived in India, at a stage when no half measures can solve our problems, no advance on one sector is enough. There has to be a big jump and advance all along the line, or the alternative may be overwhelming catastrophe. As in the world as a whole, so in India, it is a race between the forces of peaceful progress and construction, and those of disruption and disaster, with each succeeding disaster on a bigger scale than the previous one. We can view this prospect as optimists or as pessimists, according to our predilections and mental makeup. Those who have faith in a moral ordering of the universe and of the ultimate triumph of virtue can, fortunately for them, function as lookers-on, or as helpers, and cast the burden on God. Others will have to carry that burden on their own weak shoulders, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. End of Part 8, titled, India's Growth Arrested, of Chapter 10.